All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Rania Khalek. Rania is an independent journalist whose work has been seen in Alternet, Truth Out, Salon, Al Jazeera America, In These Times, all of which and more you can find at raniakhalek.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at Rania Khalek. Rania, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thank you for having me back on, Matt.
All right, so Rania, I don't know if it was a couple times ago when you were on the show, we've discussed the epidemic, because I think it's fair to call it an epidemic, of police brutality, police murdering suspects that are not actually being held accountable. And unfortunately, there are actually more instances of that to discuss. Let's go right to the first one, which actually happened in Pittsburgh, which is a pretty horrifying event. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so there's the police shooting that took place in Pittsburgh. It was actually last November, but it's receiving a little bit more coverage now. A 19-year-old named Leon Ford Jr. Was last November 11th. Was pulled over in the evening by Pittsburgh police, and things escalated from there. Police say one thing happened, Ford says things went another way, but ultimately he was pulled over, a routine traffic stop, and he ended up getting shot several times by one of the police officers, and he's now paralyzed from the waist down. And he's a young black male. Police say that they thought he was armed. They thought they saw a gun in his car. So the police officers, one of them jumped, I guess was on the passenger side and jumped into the car. And apparently after that, Ford, the young man driving, tried to flee, they say. And while he was fleeing, I guess the cop wasn't fully in the car, and the cop was dragged a little bit on the street, maybe, is what the police officers say. So because of that, and then Ford ended up crashing his car, and while that was happening, the officer shot at him several times, and that's when he was paralyzed. So police are trying to say that they charged him with assaulting a police officer, and with aggravated assault, actually, and 2 counts of reckless endangerment, along with the traffic violations. And so with all that together, he faces up to 20 years in prison. And this is a young man who was shot by police officers. And it turns out the scene was actually captured on one of the police officers' dash cam. And the dash cam actually shows that the police that the officer jumped into his car, which actually may have provoked him to drive, or the officer's the one who shifted it into gear. Who knows? But either way, there's also, accusations of police, shouting out racial epithets at him, and the police can be seen shouting at him. I mean, it's the whole story is very concerning, because it seems that police definitely were being abusive, and this young man definitely seems to have had a reason to be afraid for his life, and ultimately he was shot and he was paralyzed, and so now he's facing 20 years in prison with these, which in my opinion, are crazy, ridiculous charges. His family his parents have filed a lawsuit against the city of Pittsburgh and the police officers, and so hopefully that'll go through, because it's just an outrageous story. It's really shocking, and this isn't the first time something like this has happened, where police officers have shot somebody who's been unarmed in circumstances that are shady. At the least, are very shady, and there's one story I covered a while back. There was a man in St. Louis, an unarmed 24-year-old Lamont Dukes. He was 30. I apologize. He was 30 years old, Lamont Dukes, and he was unarmed, and he was shot twice by a police officer who was chasing him. For really shady reasons as well, and they charged him with resisting arrest. The following day, he was charged while recovering in a hospital bed. I mean, luckily he didn't die. But it's pretty outrageous for police to be charging somebody that they shot for reasons that are unlikely justified.
Yeah, and when they're not, the fact that police officers are using deadly force. And again, a cop is not supposed to pull his gun unless he's confronted with deadly force. But you have police officers pulling their guns and shooting unarmed people, and the fact that is not a crime is I mean, it is a crime, but the fact that it's rarely prosecuted is something that's really frightening and a vast horrible injustice that's going on.
Exactly. And of course, the people that this often tends to happen to is, young unarmed black men. Because of course, and the excuse you're often given by police is, oh, well, the officer was in fear for his life because the victim or suspect or whatever reached for his waist. The officer thought they were reaching for a weapon or whatever it may be. I mean, this idea that it's understandable that there are situations where police feel threatened, and of course they should be able to defend themselves and protect themselves. But at the same time, it's a pattern with this sort of implicit racist mentality that most of us in the United States are conditioned to operate under, which is when we see somebody who's of color and they're reaching for their waist or they're doing things that that are typically non-threatening behaviors. It's when a person of color is doing it, it suddenly becomes threatening because there's this underlining mentality in this country that people of color are inherently dangerous and inherently threatening, and it's really frustrating I imagine for the families who have to go through this, and it's just really frustrating to see over and over again where you have people who have been victimized by the police who are being charged. I mean, it's like a double. It's
not only they were shot in the case of the Pittsburgh kid, paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. He's never going to walk again. But he's not only has he been paralyzed, even though he did nothing wrong, he's also potentially going to spend 20 years in jail.
Exactly. It's just amazing to me that they're going after this kid like this. If they should be apologizing to him.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about another one that you documented, and that's one that happened in Cleveland. And it's another one of these instances where just the sheer amount of force used on an unarmed couple, in this case, it was a couple that was killed by the police. It's just your heart breaks and your jaw drops. Tell us what happened in Cleveland.
Well, okay, so this actually happened last November, I believe, as well. Mm-hmm. There was a Timothy Russell, who's 43, and Melissa Williams, who's 30. They're a black couple. Were driving in Cleveland, and Russell's car backfired, and this is what after investigating seems to have happened. His car backfired, and the sound of it, car backfired. If you've ever heard one, it can sound like a bullet, a gunshot. And there were, there were officers nearby, security officers nearby who heard it, and they thought that they were being shot at. Seems to be what happened. And so because of that, they reported this car is trying to shoot at us. And the Cleveland Police Department basically sent somewhere around 70 plus officers got involved in what became a huge car chase, a high-speed car chase. But, trying to get this car to stop, believing that these people were armed when they weren't. And it ended in basically a hail of police gunfire at this car. The police shot 137 times at Timothy Russell and Marissa Williams, and this was after the car had stopped. And it was like a 22-mile long car chase that lasted for almost a half an hour. And then afterwards, it turned out that no weapon was recovered. It turned out they were not armed, but that didn't seem to really matter. The police still did what they usually do whenever they shoot somebody, and they end up being unarmed, which is they tried to paint these two people who are both black as career criminals. Releasing their criminal history to the media, and the media, followed suit and reported that criminal history, and so they were basically painted as these, drug abusing thugs who had a history of violence, and so it's sort of this pattern we see a lot in the aftermath of police shootings, where it's like, oh, but see, they were career criminals, so even if they were unarmed and this didn't happen the way we thought it happened, I'm sure they deserve to die for some reason. But I mean, right. In the end, their bodies, both of them, had over 12 bullet holes each, over a dozen times, had been shot. It's just a really, really horrific way to die. And so in the end, that happened last year. It received some coverage, and then there was, the police said, okay, we're investigating this. And so the media sort of stopped looking into it. And so last week, it turned out that after an internal investigation within the police department, somewhere, I believe it was 64 officers were found guilty of administrative charges ranging from excessive speed to insubordination. And so they were disciplined, but not fired. Some of them were suspended, the longest being for 10 days. And that's it. That's all.